Good morning. Thank you everyone for joining us today. The slide deck can be found in the handout section of your webinar toolbar. Please use the question section on the right-hand side to ask questions throughout the presentation. We'll be holding all the questions till the end. We understand that we may not be able to cover all of them during the Q&A section, so we appreciate your patience. We are also sharing the slides and presentation recording link following the live presentation.
Thank you, Brittany, and thank you everyone for attending today's CPE session on lobbying, which hopefully we can simplify, getting out there, knowing the rules, and reporting your costs. My name is, if I can get my slide to advance, Brian Bender, and I am a partner here at Witham. I lead our trade association and membership organization practice here, along with all of our other partners who kind of work in that area as well in the nonprofit niche. I have personally over 17 years of experience in not only public accounting, but about 5 years outside of public accounting on the other side of the table, working for large international individual membership organization, the Optical Society, as well as 2 trades, America's Health Insurance Plans and Independent Community Bankers of America. Also, I'm a board member of PASAE, the Pennsylvania Society of Association Excellence, a little different than ASAE's saying, and also an audit committee of the Pittsburgh Foundation. A little personal info. I'm also a father of 4, one of which is of the canine variety, our 11-year-old dog Zoe, and 3 daughters, 6-year-old, 2-year-old, and +1 in December. I also married to my wife, and full disclosure for a lobbying presentation, she is a lobbyist, so it makes for some fun dinner conversations, although we do try to leave a lot at the door when we get home. And you also find my contact information there, and I know Brittany mentioned you can put your questions in the question box, but also if you do need to or would like to contact me after the presentation, feel free to email me or call the number there. And I'm happy to introduce, but allow her to introduce herself, Michaela Isler. She is not only a longtime client, but a friend, and I couldn't ask for a better co-presenter today. So Michaela, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, thank you, Brian, for this invitation to be with all of you today. It's a pleasure to be here. Currently, I am the Executive Director of the National Association of Business Political Action Committees. We are a national trade association that represents the business PAC community. Interestingly, we are not a PAC, although we do advocate on the behalf of PACs and also help with best practices and curating resources for our members within sort of professional development. We have about 800 individual members and from almost 300 corporations and other business trade associations. And as I said, our mission really is to defend and protect the business PAC community. I have been working in politics for almost 30 years. I got started at the state level in Texas, working for a party committee, and then went on to work for the Texas Association of Business. And I have sort of all facets of government relations under my belt thus far. I've lobbied both at the state and federal level, and I've also run large-scale political programs, PAC grassroots issue advocacy for both state trade associations, national trade associations, and corporations. And so happy to share what I've learned over the 30 years with all of you today, and hope we can kind of keep it as simple as possible because it is a little bit of a complex business. But Brian, I'm happy to turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Michaela. And before I advance this slide, I will, because Michaela, you are modest, but you are a 2021 top lobbyist by the Hill and National Institute for Lobbying and Ethics. So again, thank you for being.
Hey, Brian, I think we've lost you.
I apologize. I was muted. Wouldn't be a webinar without that. But thank you again. I was saying that thank you again for being here with us today. And you are modest, but you are, of course, a top lobbyist 2021 from Nile and the Hill. So before I jump into the agenda today, wanted to just read a quote. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has, by Margaret Mead. I think that a lot of government relations professionals can relate to, there are a lot of small groups of trades and charities out there, and there's a lot of impact that can be made in the area of advocacy. So it's one of the reasons why I specialize in this area, because I see the value and I see the importance of getting other positions and thoughts and ideas out there to make change. So today we are going to cover what is lobbying, and actually this is, I'm going to hand it over to Michaela soon, and she's going to cover what is lobbying, because she's the expert in walking us through what it is and how to do it, as well as providing examples from her more than 30 years of experience at the state and federal and political organization level, and hopefully giving us some context to how things have really changed over the last 2 years. I think a lot of organizations have found themselves in this arena and might not be familiar with the requirements from a compliance standpoint on how to move forward. From that point on, I'll take over and talk about some of the different definitions of lobbying, mainly focused in the area of those definitions under the LDA, although there's a lot of similarities to that definition and registration at the state level, but also how that differs from the IRS's definition of lobbying under the Form 990. And then we'll talk about tracking those lobbying expenses as well. So with that, we have our first polling question, which should be popping up here soon. Brittany?
I actually realized you can't see it because you're the presenter, so I will read it off for you. It is, whom do you lobby? It's members and or of the Congress and or administration, members of states, General Assembly, states administration, federal and state, or none of the above.
Awesome. So we just wanted to get a feel of the room here with this question. So no right or wrong answer, but yeah, give it a couple more seconds.
Yep, we got a couple more seconds. We got about 85% voted, so close it out in a few seconds. All righty, closing it out now. And we have 21% said members of the Congress and or administration, 10% said members of states, General Assembly and or states administration, 14% said federal and state, and 55% said none of the above.
Awesome. So this is really exciting because there's a lot of individuals here who might not lobby. And so, talking about getting out there and really becoming active is an important thing that we can talk about. So we're going to actually lead off with our second polling question right after that. Brittany, did you want to open it up?
Okay. Here we are. 501c3 public charities are not allowed to lobby. True or false?
So this one, however, does have a right and wrong answer. So just wanted to, again, lead off with 2 questions, getting some of the housekeeping out of the way for the CPEs. So give you a couple seconds here.
We're about halfway there. Give it about 15 more seconds. All right, get those last minute votes in. All right, we have 70% said false and 30% said true.
So the 70% are correct. This is a false statement. 501c3 public charities are allowed to lobby, which it brings me to my next slide. This is a stat from the National Council of Nonprofits report in 2019, Nonprofit Matters. and less than 3% of 501c3 public charities that lobby to advance their mission, compared to 100% that have the legal right to do so. So there are limits to C3 charities, but every 501c3 has the right and ability to lobby and advocate for their missions. And I do think it's very interesting as we talk about charities that the less than 3% at the top is shaped as a heart. So with that, I'm going to hand this to back to Michaela.
Great, thanks, Brian. And I cannot see the slides. I still have them pulled up. So if you could maybe advance to the next slide.
Yeah, let me just do this.
I have it on what is lobbying.
Well, I can get started while we're trying to pull up the slides, but really, I mean, at the end of the day, I want to just first say that elected officials do want to hear from all of you and all of us. Thank you, Brittany, appreciate that. And really, in the simplest terms, it is an attempt to influence legislation both at the state and federal level. You know, it is by definition intended to influence legislation. And so I think the first thing is understanding that, but really taking a few steps back and trying to decipher, are we going to be lobbying at the state level, at the federal level? Because you really, before you do anything when it comes to lobbying, you want to understand the rules of the road, right? And so understanding what the registration requirements are before you even get out and start talking to legislators and staff, what the filing requirements are. I would also recommend most of the states, if you're at the state level and at the federal level, do also offer a lot of training for you, especially for beginners who haven't lobbied before, so that you can understand the rules of the road. And then also understanding what the giving rules are. So can you only give through a PAC? Can you give association or corporate dollars, individual dollars? And what are the rules for maybe starting a PAC in your state? Every state is different, and it's also different from at the federal level. And if you're going to be lobbying both at the state and federal level, you know, just really understanding the difference and prioritizing sort of where you're going to allocate your resources. And I don't know, for some reason the slides on my screen are not showing properly, but if you want to advance to the next slide, that would be great. I would just say too, in any effort as you're looking to establish maybe a government relations operation within your association, there really are 3 stools of effective engagement. And we like to talk about your issue advocacy and understanding the issues that you're facing. And I would say there's a whole process around prioritizing the issues of your organization. If you don't already, you'd want to have a committee that helps you come up with your priority issues for an organization. And I would just say keep it simple, especially if you're just starting out, maybe identifying 1 or 2 key issues that are maybe realistic in their chances of maybe getting through a legislative body. Your grassroots program, how are you going to engage your members? Who's going to influence legislators at the state and or federal level? And then again, understanding that PAC piece, the giving piece, because the PAC really allows you and your members an opportunity to develop relationships with key elected officials. And I guess I would say, as you start any endeavor as it relates to lobbying, is you really do want to make sure that you have your processes in place as an organization, you have decision makers around the table, but you also have the proper funds allocated. And so making sure that you have the right people. Do you need in-house lobbyists? Do you need contract lobbyists? Sometimes you need a combination of both, especially at the state level. Most associations kind of group their state lobbying efforts by regions, and so it's very difficult for one person to have connections and deep connections in every state that they're covering. Sometimes you may cover the entire country, and so you really want to prioritize what the issues are, but you also need to understand what else is going on in those legislative bodies, both at the state and federal level. Just because there's a major issue that's important to you and your organization, it may not be a priority for that state legislature at the federal level. As we all know, there are a lot of competing interests right now, particularly at the federal level when we think about all of the issues we're facing with supply chain issues and inflation and just general economic concerns. Really understanding and managing expectations of your members on how realistic it is to get maybe an issue across the finish line. I will say lobbying can sometimes be very frustrating for those of you that are used to, being able to sort of cross things off your list, on a regular basis, especially at the federal level. Sometimes it takes a decade to get a piece of legislation across the finish line. And so understanding that and really knowing just sort of the other competing issues and interests. Also, I would just say, as you're laying out your lobbying efforts and what the issues are, really understanding who your opponents will be and what arguments they may have for you to be able to understand and sort of counter their arguments as well. Government affairs advocacy is more than a full-time job. It's really it's not cheap to put on a government affairs program that's fully just all-encompassing. But I would also say don't be concerned so much that you can't. Sometimes you just have to start small. And so maybe it's identifying one or two issues that you're going to really focus on and build from there. And show some wins early on. Maybe it's just developing some key relationships. Maybe it's you've identified some candidates early on that you want to develop a long-term relationship with, and you help them get elected. Those are all things that could be celebrated as wins. Also, I would say too, sometimes you may be on defense more than offense. And what I mean by that is your opponents may be bringing forward legislation that you actually are able to, as we refer to in the business, is kill those bills. But if you're able to stop some of those bills, I would say that that's a big win. And really trying to come up with ways to quantify based on the priorities of your organization. It is hard to quantify, but what would the impact of that bill have on your organization were it to pass? And so in my experience over the years, we've spent a lot of time looking back at bills that what would have happened if this bill passed, maybe 2 years ago? What would have happened to the industry, to the market, to our association's members? I do think that as you begin your government affairs efforts, really understanding outside of just sort of the basics that we talked about earlier, registration, filings, training, what the political giving laws are, what is the current makeup of your membership? Do they already have connections that you can build upon? So really assessing your membership and where they may have relationships at both the state and federal level. If you're just starting out, this is all stuff that you can certainly manage in even an Excel spreadsheet, but there are vendors out there that specialize in sort of relationship development and champion programs. And so before you really go out and do anything, let's look at who we already have relationships with through our membership. I would say too, as you're engaging your members, I think you're going to want to spend a good amount of time training them on the rules and regulations. The last thing you would want is for a member who just doesn't understand what the rules are when they're going in to lobby an elected official. You don't want that to sort of blow up in your face. There just are some sort of rules of the road and some etiquette too that just always is good to remind your members about. But investing in that training of your members, making sure that the issues are really specific, kind of that elevator pitch. What are the three main issues we want to talk about? Really will go a long way in your overall efforts. But having those relationships in the district or back home are really key to the overall success of your government affairs advocacy and programs. I often see organizations that want to do all these big grandiose things, but also don't necessarily have the budget to do it. And so I just want to, it's not a cheap endeavor. My philosophy has always been start small, show some wins, and build from there, because ultimately you'll become the bigger program that maybe you want to be, but it's going to take some time. It doesn't happen overnight. You've got coalitions that you can work with. You've got other groups that may be aligned with you on certain issues. And you want to spend some time trying to identify who those folks are, especially if you are maybe a little bit more strapped on the fund side, to sort of, like, spread the wealth a little bit and have everyone sort of pitch in where they can to help get your issues across the line. And so with that, I think, Brian, I've covered my main points. I'm happy to turn it back over to you.
Well, thank you, Michaela. And I honestly think I got a little behind on the slides, so I apologize. I think I was oversharing like I tend to do sometimes. But those were all really great points, and I got more into what you were saying than advancing the slides. So I did want to ask you a little bit about how you communicate with congressional staff versus members. I think there's a lot of organizations that think they have to get member level meetings and reach out and starting the conversation. But can you talk a little bit about what levels you want to start at, or to work up to, or to connect with to get things really done?
And that's a great question. This can be very overwhelming. I know when I first started lobbying, I thought I had to know every single member of, the legislature and their staff. And the reality is it's just impossible. And if you're not from that state or haven't lobbied at the federal level, you're not going to have the relationships right out of the gate. And so I would spend some time trying to identify whether through it's your membership or maybe contract lobbyists or in-house lobbyists that you may hire, like, where are the relationships that we have? And what are the issues of most importance? And once you know the issue, then you can go back and look at where that issue will be debated in the legislature. So what is the committee of jurisdiction? And so, because I lobbied for the banking and property and casualty insurance industries, most of our issues were really housed in financial services committees. And so we spent most of our time trying to go back and research the members of each of those committees, how they voted on issues of importance to our industry in the past. Are they folks that are maybe on the fence on some issues that we may be able to go in and educate a little bit more on why whatever issue is important and why it should be passed or even defeated if that's the case. And I think this is the key, doing your research really is so critically important, and understanding. I talk a lot about, facts are important, and having all of the data and research that your organization can come up with to really drive home the importance of these issues and why you need to get these issues across the finish line. But I will also say sometimes the facts may not matter as much depending on what's going on politically in a legislative session. There just may be some pretty politically charged issues going on that have nothing to do with your industry. And so your issues just may be backbenched, quite frankly. And so really understanding where these legislators are coming from, the pressures that they're under on other issues that they're facing. I am someone who would attend really every single committee hearing that had to do with the Financial Services Committee, because I like to just observe what was going on in the room. I wanted to see who was talking to whom, which legislators were talking to which lobbyists, if they were talking to, the trial lawyers or the labor union guys, and, kind of what their relationships look like, because I just wanted to understand, where we would be on any particular issue. So spending that time doing the research and knowing your issue is certainly important. And I would just say, as a lobbyist, your number one job is to be responsive and to be truthful. And so if a legislator, look, they have thousands and thousands of bills that come before them every session. And if you're lobbying at the state level, these bills move very, very quickly. Most states' legislative sessions are very short. They mostly all begin in January, and many are done really by April. Virginia has what we call a rocket docket legislative session. And so I'm telling you, it's every single day for 6 weeks they meet, and it's really fast paced, and you have to be on alert. And so you really need to be equipped with the facts. And if a legislator calls you and asks you for information, they rely on lobbyists. They can't be an issue expert on every single issue. And so you want to position yourself to be that go-to person on whatever the issue is. And so, and being responsive and being honest. And I will tell you too that in many of our discussions, I would even be very upfront about who our opponents were on a particular issue, and being prepared to counter what we would think their arguments were with the legislator. And sometimes the legislators would say, look, you need to go and work this out with the other side, and come back with a resolution. You know, we don't want to be in a position to find the resolution for you, but you guys need to work it out and come back to us and tell us what. You see this a lot more at the state level. But a lot of times these conversations, Brian, as you mentioned, are happening with the staff. The legislators can't be in every single meeting and can't meet with every single lobbyist. They rely on their staff. At the state level, you don't have as many staff as you do maybe at the federal level that are focused on certain issues. But developing those relationships are going to be essential, because you want to be sharing that information with the staff and also the committee staff. So oftentimes, if you're dealing with the Financial Services Committee, just as an example, if you're meeting with key legislators or sponsors on any bill that is in that committee, you're going to also want to go make sure you have relationships with the committee staff, and making sure that you have those relationships as well, because they control which bills are getting put up on the floor and in committee and in debate. And so again, you need those facts, you need the information, you need to be able to testify succinctly. I would also say a lot of times at the state level, they really do not love when you come in to testify and read, 10 pages of testimony. This is where you really want to have your elevator pitch. You want to have a really succinct, to the point, what's the bottom line. You can always submit the longer written testimony, but that number 4 here on the screen, communicating, is so critically important, and you're going to have to practice. And sometimes what you think might resonate just doesn't resonate at all. And always follow up and always say thank you. It's just another touch point to have those opportunities to continue to develop those relationships that are so important.
Just listening to you talk, Michaela, I know there's so much that goes into the whole process. And one of the things that keeps coming to my mind is, how do you make a connection with a legislator or their staff, and make that connection between your mission and your members and their constituents? Can you talk to how important that is to coming into a meeting prepared to speak to basically how, and I hate to say it this way, but how your meeting translates to votes?
Yeah, I think you kind of have to not really look at it that way, especially in the beginning. I think it's really about developing that, just showing up, first of all, being at the coffee, being at the breakfast, being at the committee hearing, working with your either external or internal lobbyists to find opportunities to get in front of. I mean, I will tell you, my first year lobbying, I was kind of a young buck, but I will be honest with you, I didn't say a whole heck of a lot in that first year, because I was really trying to observe and get a feel for just all of the issues that were at play, who the players were, who may be emerging leaders. At the state level, you also need to really understand, these legislative sessions tend to be 2-year sessions. And so, understanding like how fast some of these bills may move or not move, and what that means to your issue. So a lot of states have something called a crossover period. And if a bill doesn't get out and out of one chamber by the crossover, it's really dead for the 2-year session. So just even understanding those types of things may dictate how much you talk, truthfully. I mean, if you're coming in the second year of a 2-year session, you really need to understand at a state level. Now, states like New Jersey, Pennsylvania, where they have year-round legislative sessions, this doesn't necessarily apply. But for states that have this crossover period, it is very rare that in the second year of a 2-year session that much is going to pass, especially if it didn't get through one chamber already in the first year. And they tend to focus on the budget, because unlike at the federal level, they do have to pass a budget per their constitutions, and that tends to drive up a lot of space in the second year of the session. So being around, being a familiar face, you can always set up a meeting directly with the committee staff or the staffer in the office. And I would use those first few opportunities just to introduce yourself. It really don't even go in and maybe jump right into a particular bill or issue unless it's moving fast and you need to. But really, as you're starting out, is just positioning yourself as a resource. I'm here, here's who I lobby for, here's who I'm with. We represent, XYZ number of members. One thing at NABPAC we love to say, because our members represent every single congressional district in the country. And that's powerful. And so really identifying those legislators that are going to be key to your issues, start with them. And just start with a 101, just this is who I am, here's how we operate, here are the issues we're focused on, we look forward to working with you. And then it's just a repetitive business, Brian, as you're at the breakfast, you're at the lunch, you're at the committee hearing, you're at the dinners. I have even identified, legislators' charity projects, and we've helped with some of their charity priorities. And so that's sort of kind of next level, but it just shows the legislator that you are serious and that you are there to do the right thing.
So making the connection so that when they do have a question on a certain issue, they have you as a resource to go to, and you can obviously educate them on your position and your member's position or your company's position on that issue. That's awesome. And this is a great lead into, I actually, this was one of the examples. I mentioned I was on the Pennsylvania Association for ASAE, the Pennsylvania ASAE, Society for Association Excellence. And nationally, PASAE has their lobby day, and we did it virtually about a year and a half ago. And this on the screen now was one of the leave behinds. So making that connection to, this is what ASAE was nationally, and here's our Pennsylvania state impact to the association world, and providing ourselves as a resource to them. So my question back to you, Michaela, is how important are leave behinds? And in that thank you, how do you connect those resources to make them kind of think after?
So they're very important, but I would just say that oftentimes, sadly, they're likely left on a desk, this high, stacked with other leave behinds, or they get thrown right in the trash. However, you have to have them. You need to put the effort into doing them, because this slide right here is just a great, almost like a cheat sheet when you go in to meet with the legislators, and you can use this. It really helps to almost focus you in on what are the main issues and priorities that you want to get across in that first introductory meeting. They may look at it and glance at it, but I don't, they may save it for a rainy day, but unfortunately everybody's got one of these, but they are important to have, and you've got to have the accurate information to be able to share with them. And it's amazing how they will recall that meeting, and they'll recall something big, like, $480 million in wages is important. And look at, this is in New Jersey. So they may remember that stat, and then that gives them an opportunity to then maybe get in touch with you later down the road. Maybe a particular issue is moving through the legislature, and they'll say, look, I remember meeting you. I remember you had this. Can we dive into that a little bit more? And that's really what these one-pagers and these leave behinds do, is hopefully it's the beginning of a conversation, and hopefully it allows further discussion when needed, and maybe to dive into some of the stats a little bit more. And this is where, as an association, I have been in organizations where we didn't really have a dedicated issue sort of expertise, and I've been in associations where we had a really robust issue education where they would help put these together for us. And so as you're looking to start your government affairs program, you probably are going to want to be sure that you've got some experts on your team that can really dive in on sort of the impacts of your organization on the US economy, but also really what these bills will do and understanding how they impact your issues.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Michaela, and I will stop asking questions, because I think I could talk to you pretty much all day. And I'm going to jump into polling question number 3, which, Brittany, if you want to read that off for us.
Yep. So what are 501c3 organizations expressly prohibited from doing that 501c4, 501c5, and 501c6 can do? Posting voting records, distributing questionnaires, promoting or opposing specific candidates or electioneering, or holding public forums. And give it about 15 more seconds. We got about 50% voted so far.
Awesome.
All right, get those last minute votes in, and I'm gonna close it out. All right, we have 7% said posting voting records, 0% said distributing questionnaires, 85% said promoting or opposing specific candidates or electioneering, and 7% said holding public forums.
Awesome. So that is correct. You need to be nonpartisan as a 501c3, and I'm sure Michaela can talk a lot about being nonpartisan, but you can't be saying that you are, opposing a candidate or that you're lobbying for a candidate for their election. And this is really important because as I go into the next slide, that's as a C3, as a C4, 5, or 6, you are allowed to do a certain level of this, but as a C3, you are prohibited from doing this kind of activity. So I wanted to talk very briefly about what this means for individuals. This is not meant to obviously restrict anybody individually from taking a position on and participating in the election process. But what I wanted to caution all executive directors, officers, registered lobbyists, or anybody of influence is doing anything on the clock. Anything that you do as an individual, giving contributions, volunteering, letters of support, especially as an executive director, if it's a part of a day, I would suggest that you take the day off. You disconnect yourself. You don't post anything on social media that's connected to your organization. You want to really take a hands-off approach. There's a lot of implications to having combined work/life in this area if you operate your organization in a way that it needs to be nonpartisan, because that is skewing the lines a little bit. So anyway, word of caution. Now, how do we define lobbying? This is everybody has a different perspective to what a lobbyist is. And I think that some of this we could almost say what is an auditor too. I think some clients look at us like the dog in the picture, but I think that what's very important is there are a lot of actual definitions of lobbying that we need to look at. And I'm going to put the next slide up, and it might be a shock to some folks, and I'm going to break this down. This is my ultimate cheat sheet, so to say, for lobbying. And that's because you need to consider a couple different definitions for multiple reasons. Two main that I'll mention. One is registering as a lobbyist, and the second is reporting to the IRS. The first portion, as far as registering, uses one definition for federal lobbying, so registering at the federal level under the Lobbying Disclosure Act, or the LDA. So that definition aligns with a lot of states, but you should be aware if you're at the state level, you need to look at your individual state regulations. There are different regulations for each state, and that's why national organizations that lobby in all 50 states tend to contract out their lobbying in those states, basically to pass on the registration requirements, because a lot of times you don't have resources at the national level to understand all those compliance laws. So I'm going to talk in generalities and give a couple examples as we move through, but in general, I want everyone to look at the right-hand column to start, and that is the definition for registering under the LDA. So what is included in lobbying? As far as moving down the left-hand side, really it's only legislative lobbying and executive lobbying. And the LDA uses a very broad definition of what is executive branch covered officials. So there's things that you don't include under the LDA for federal registration. You don't include state and local lobbying. You don't include your grassroots campaigns. You don't include international lobbying, and you don't include political expenditures. So money that you spend, say if you're a C6 association, you spend at the C6 level to pay your PAC administrators. You would not include that in your federal LDA lobbying calculation. Now moving from right to left, you have two separate definitions of lobbying, one for 501c3s in the middle, and one on the left for 501c4, 5s, and 6s under the IRS Regulation 162E. That 162E also applies to companies. What that means is that is the non-deductible lobbying requirement. So those two definitions align very, very closely. So what you'll see is when you're calculating lobbying to include on your IRS Form 990 under Schedule C, you would include things like state and local lobbying. You do include things like grassroots. You do include things like international lobbying. It actually mentions it right on the form of Schedule C for the 990 and calculating that amount. So, and you also include your PAC administrators and PAC costs. And as NABPAC, Michaela would tell you, is their invoices that they send to members tell them that it is 100% non-deductible, because the cost of NABPAC is to inform their members on how to be PAC administrators. So this kind of flows into these definitions. And the one piece that is a little different between the C3 definition and the 501c4, 5, and 6 definition is that executive branch covered official. So you'll see that 501c4, 5s, and 6s, there's a narrow definition of what is executive branch lobbying, and the LDA has a broader definition. Now, in practice, for organizations that do track their costs under both definitions, you'll see that most of them don't do a separate federal executive lobbying calculation. They'll just use the LDA lobbying, because tracking that time separately can sometimes be quite cost prohibitive. Now, I will mention, if you do file your LD2, there is an option on the LD2 to also report those costs as you would under the IRS Form 990. So it's really an administrative simplification option. Some organizations choose not to report that way, simply because that would report a larger number on a quarterly basis under your LD2. So again, this gets really gray and really complex as far as what is and is not lobbying in a lot of areas, because there's a lot of, as we'll get into, costs that go into this, and questions that you should be asking yourself as far as if you're doing research for a lobbying ask versus research to educate. And that sometimes changes along the way. So it's definitely a conversation that needs had at your organization, with everyone understanding what definition you're using at what stage. So if that's not confusing enough, we're gonna mention what is not lobbying. So as I mentioned, providing research and educational materials is not lobbying. If you're responding to requests from congressional offices, that's not lobbying. Issues affecting your exempt status, so you're protecting yourself, that is not considered lobbying. Also, if you're a grant-seeking organization, that's not lobbying as well. Or testifying before a committee. All of this is not lobbying, as defined under the standards. So as you start to think about, well, I might do a little bit of lobbying, am I required to register? And the question is, the answer is a resounding maybe, depending on where and what you're doing. So at the federal level, there is two requirements. That you have at least one employee who spends 20% of their time on lobbying efforts at the federal level under that LDA definition. So legislative and executive branch lobbying. And that they have one federal contact. And typically, if you're spending 20% of your time, you have a federal contact as a covered official. Now, at the state level, the trend is, from the states that I've seen, and Michaela, you've seen way more states than I have, but the trend is that that level is very much lower. And I've used Pennsylvania here as an example, and it's not an and here, it's an or. So Pennsylvania, the reason I wanted to include that as an example is not only is the threshold significantly lower, but also, which is $3,000 in any reporting period per quarter, which you can reach very quickly, but also could be 20 hours of time during the reporting period, and that is not paid time. So you could have a volunteer board member that lobbies, that puts you into a requirement. And if they are very connected and the state, oversight authority, I'll call it, because it changes from state to state, identifies that, there could be fees and penalties as well as the PR fallout from that. So this is why you should be very cautious, not only when looking at the individual state requirements and when you start to cross borders, because you could be hitting into that not only gray waters. So how much lobbying can a 501c3 do? So this is, I'm switching gears from registration to IRS requirements. So I'm going to start with C3s and move on to C6s. So as a 501c3, you can lobby what's defined as an insubstantial part of your operations. So to make it very confusing, the IRS has a test called the substantial parts test to see if an insubstantial part of your operations are lobbying efforts. Now, to make it even grayer, the IRS has not put a bright line on that amount, on what is insubstantial. And I'll explain why that's important on the next slide. And I'll just roll on into that. And that's because 501c3s have an option, if you lobby, to file the IRS Form 5768, or what's more commonly known as the 501h election. And this election sets that bright line for an organization. And so it's a really scaled approach based on your expenditures. So basically, and you'll see this in the IRS Form 990 on Schedule C, if it calculates 20% of your first $500,000, 15% of the next $500,000, and it keeps going until it says, okay, at 1.5 million, 5% of the next 15.5 million is qualifying expenditures. And basically, it sets that bright line at $1 million in maximum lobbying that you can do as a 501c3. And you hit that $1 million at $17 million of expenditures. So that protects you because it sets what's substantial and insubstantial. Now, an organization might not want to file their 501h election as a C3 if, say, you have a $100 million budget or a $200 million budget. If you have substantial expenditures, the insubstantial piece of what you do could be well over $1 million. And $1 million, remember that top level calculation was being calculated at 5%. So, that would be a position that you would want to talk to your attorney or your tax lawyer to develop, to say what is insubstantial, and not only set that amount on what is reasonable based on the law in various jurisdictions that you operate in, but also budget to make sure that you stay within those amounts. And the other option is if you could file your 501h and you could set up a 501c4 or a 501c6 that operates in conjunction with your charity. And there's other reasons to do that too, meaning if you want to set up a political action committee, or you want to have a political organization that's attached to another organization. So you want to be very careful on the structure when you start to go in that route, but it's a very common question that we get and something that we've helped our clients structure in the past. As a C4, 5, or 6, you can do as much lobbying as your hearts want to. The limitation that you have, though, is that you can only do a certain amount of political campaign intervention activities. So that can't be primarily what you do, but otherwise you can lobby as much as you want. The the question gets back to these lobbying expenditures under that 162 definition of lobbying. And what this means for membership-driven organizations is that you have an option for your lobbying expenditures, and that is that you can either pass on the non-deductibility to your membership through putting on the bottom of your membership dues disclosure that they cannot deduct those amounts for federal income tax purposes. And so, or you can pay a proxy tax. And that proxy tax is set at the top federal rate. And so you see, I would say, a mix in the industry. Some decide to pay the proxy tax. More commonly, those lobbying costs are passed on to membership. And a select few of them, I would say probably about 5%, if I were to have to put a percentage on it, will put a non-deductible amount. And if the organization goes over it, they decide to just pay that proxy tax. And it gives the organization some consistency as far as what their membership can expect for those non-deductible dues. The important thing to do at the end of the year for all of these organizations is to look at that amount and say, do we have any carryover, either overages or underages? Because as everyone knows who has a membership base, is you bill at the beginning of the year or before the end of the year. So you're really looking at the following year and estimating what your lobbying expenses will be. So once you get to the end of the year, you need to say, did we do more? Did we do less? Maybe there were some things that didn't have a legislative ask and it was more regulatory work that you ended up doing. So that's why it's important to look at those actual amounts. And as we saw with COVID and the CARES Act, we saw a lot of increases in the amount of lobbying that organizations did because they started to operate at that federal level because when they never did before, because there was a vested interest of not only companies and organizations, but their membership to participate in that legislative process. And another footnote here too, as there is a registration requirement that has a threshold at the federal level, which is 20% of time. The IRS does not care that you only spent 1% of your time. There is a de minimis limit on the amount of lobbying that is not includable for a 501c4, 5 or 6. So if you have $5,000 worth of time or expenses, those need to be included in your lobbying calculation. And those are as defined by the IRS, which included all those different areas. So local, state, federal, grassroots, international, the whole list needs to be considered when you're looking at what is defined as lobbying under the IRS. So with that, how do you calculate these costs? And it's really interesting because I've seen probably 100 different types of calculations in the past, but we're going to talk about some of the major drivers of those expenses here. So first and foremost, if you have a department, a government relations department, you'll want to look at their salaries, and you'll want to look at obviously all of those things that relate to their salaries and time. And if you don't have a timesheet system to be able to say, okay, well, lobbyist A, you spend 10% of your time on federal lobbying, 10% of your time on state lobbying, and down the line, and what is and is not defined under the IRS as lobbying, you need to be having a meeting with that individual and or your teams on a monthly or at least a quarterly basis to report those amounts out as required. Or if there's more consistent reporting at your state level, you would need to do that as well. And that's a simple, sitting down with the individuals and assessing what they did over that period. And then carrying out the calculation, not only with their salaries, but looking at taxes and fringe benefits and allocating overhead costs. So things like rent, IT, those types of things that could be indirectly related to what they're doing needs to be included in that calculation as far as cost. Now, a lot of especially state organizations will say, I outsource my lobbying and I have a consultant and I include 100% of their time and I'm good to go. That's all I need to worry about. And I would say you probably have more questions to ask if that's what you're doing. So as far as direct expenses, that's typically the #1 direct expense. But for your consultants, the first question I would say is they probably are not spending 100% of their time on lobbying. As defined under the IRS. They could be doing regs work, they could be doing education, they could be doing a lot of different things. Is it possible that 100% of what they're doing is legislative lobbying? It could be. It's not in my experience. So you're probably over-reporting that amount. On the flip side of that, I would also ask you, if that's how you're reporting your costs, who oversees that lobbyist? And potentially, in most cases, it's your executive director, your CEO, and they probably spend a certain amount of time and effort in overseeing those activities. So those costs should also be included, even if they don't reach the state or the federal requirements for registering. So again, IRS definition, you need to look at time, costs, and both direct and indirect. And I am reaching the end of our session here. So I'm going to speed through this last bullet here, and then I think we have one more poll. But as far as one item that I wanted to point out specific to direct expenses, and if you all know the IRS is always looking to get their money. And with non-deductible dues for membership organizations, one of the things that you always want to look at is that non-deductible dues disclosure. It's commonly missed. I would say 90% of the time, maybe even 95% of the time. Organizations who pay membership dues don't necessarily look to see, I'm part of a coalition, I'm part of another membership group, I'm part of another joint activity, whereas that activity could be have a lobbying component to it. So if I'm a member of a coalition and that coalition just lobbies and I pay membership dues, if maybe they say on their invoice 80% of these amounts are non-deductible, you need to also include that in your lobbying calculation amount, whether you're a C3 and it goes into your direct lobbying, or if you're a C6, that amount would need flown down through to your membership. Because ultimately what the IRS is saying is that non-deductible dues flows down to you, and if you're another C6, you need to flow that down to your membership. So that ultimately it's not included as a taxable deduction or pay the property tax on it. So that's just another common error in lobbying calculations that I've seen throughout the years. So with that, I'm going to go to our final polling question. Brittany?
All right. So we have, my organization is an unconnected political action committee, has a connected political action committee, does not have a political action committee but may consider in the future, and does not have a political action committee and probably never will.
And this, Michaela, was my my gift to you to see how many folks are involved in your world of NABPAC. So
Thank you, Brian.
And maybe while we wait, you can kind of talk about the importance of including a PAC strategy in GR. Yeah,
and you'll need to, depending on how your organization is structured, first determine if you're even allowed to have a political action committee. And I will just say, again, nothing simple with political action committees, because that's a whole separate set of campaign finance rules and regulations, and understanding who you can solicit and who you can't, how much money you can give, how much money you can raise. But it is, if you're allowed to have a political action committee, I would just say if you're looking to start a government relations program and you can have a PAC, I would strongly recommend. It is, as we say at NABPAC, it's the most regulated form of giving in our political system. It's accountable, and it's all public knowledge. And so it looks like here in the results that many of you probably won't ever have a PAC. But if that is something that you do want to reconsider, of course, just understanding, again, the rules of the road, who you can solicit, who you can't, and what the limits are and how much you can raise and how much you can give. It's a whole other strategy. It's an arm of your government relations program. I would recommend making sure, both on the lobbying side and the PAC side, I can't stress this enough, you really ought to invest in, as you're looking at your structure, in a really strong campaign finance and lobbying attorney who can help navigate all of this, because you really want to be sure that you have everything set up properly before you start lobbying or engaging in PAC activity. So I know a lot of times in-house lobbyists who don't have that expertise try to have that expertise, and that can be kind of on-the-job training, and there's just a lot to consider. So most trade associations and organizations do contract out specific campaign finance lawyers to help navigate all of these rules and regulations.
I couldn't have summed up this presentation and what's important better, Michaela, than talk to your trusted advisors, talk to your accountant, talk to your attorney. Make sure you have the right people in the room when you talk about advocacy, both at the registration level and the reporting level, to make sure that you're doing your constituents, your members, your companies, you're giving that component of how you can add value its due. So again, thank you so much, Michaela, for joining me today. I really appreciate it. It's always a pleasure. And thank you everyone today. Again, my contact information is included on the slide deck. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me, and happy to connect you to Michaela as well.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you all.
And thank you everybody again for joining us today. We'll be sending a follow-up email with the PowerPoint presentation and webinar recording. Please take a moment to fill out our post-webinar survey. And thank you again. Have a great day.